a gym owner named after a fitness legend, a rival bodybuilding contest, and a leading lady who didn't just star in the film, she wrote it, at a moment when almost nobody in her industry was doing that. This is the story of Body Girls, an 84-minute adult feature shot in 1983 that most people have never heard of and that, on its own, wouldn't seem to deserve much attention at all. But look at it next to the year it came out, and it turns into something more interesting. A small, disposable piece of a much bigger cultural moment, one where leg warmers and leotards had briefly become the most talked about fashion item in America, and where an entire industry was scrambling to cash in on it. By 1983, Bob Chinn was already one of the most established names in adult filmmaking. A UCLA film school graduate, reportedly a classmate of a young Jim Morrison, years before the Doors existed. Chinn had spent the 1970s building the Johnny Wad series, a private detective franchise that turned John Holmes into the industry's most recognizable name. The first Johnny Wad film was reportedly written almost overnight, on a script just a few pages long, and it launched a 9-film run that changed how adult films were made, with recurring characters, real plots, and something closer to a franchise mentality than the loose, one-off loops that had dominated before it. Decades later, Chinn would become widely cited as the inspiration for Burt Reynolds' director character in Boogie Nights. By the early 80s, Chinn was working under Caribbean Films, and he'd built a close creative partnership with a husband and wife team, performer and writer Hyapatia Lee and her husband, director and performer Bud Lee. Together, over a handful of films in this period, they developed a recognizable style, glossier than the genre's average, built around real locations and a real attempt at story, even if the plot stayed thin by design. Body Girls was one of 4 collaborations this team made together in this stretch, and by most later assessments, it's considered the slightest of the 4. But it's also the one that leaned hardest into a trend that, in 1983, was inescapable. Body Girls centers on Jackie LaLanne, the owner of a successful health club, a name that's a clear wink at Jack LaLanne, the real-life fitness personality who'd spent decades as the face of American exercise culture. Jackie's gym is preparing to compete in a regional bodybuilding contest against a rival club, and when that rival club starts playing dirty, sending people to sabotage equipment and intimidate the contest's judges, Jackie and her members band together to protect the competition and secure their win. It's a threadbare plot, and nobody involved seemed to be pretending otherwise. One of the film's comic supporting characters, a bodybuilder with an exaggerated accent, is named Arnold Ferragamo, a none-too-subtle mashup of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno, the 2 biggest bodybuilders turned celebrities of the era. The structure exists almost entirely to move from one gym scenario to the next, and reviewers looking back on it have generally agreed it's a lesser entry in the Chinn-Lee filmography. Well shot, briskly paced, but not particularly ambitious even by the standards of the genre. It's also worth flagging, for anyone revisiting the film today, that one sequence early on plays very differently by modern standards than it likely did in 1983. A reminder of just how much has shifted in what this kind of film considered acceptable content over the last 40-plus years. What makes Body Girls worth a second look isn't the plot, it's Hyapatia Lee's role behind it. Born Vicky Lynch in the Hauville neighborhood of Indianapolis, Lee came up through local theater and dance before winning the Miss Nude Galaxy pageant twice in 1979 and 1981, which pushed her into modeling and then adult film. From nearly the start of her career, she wrote her own material. Body Girls is credited to her pen, and she'd go on to direct, produce, and even compose music for her own films, a level of creative control that was unusual for a performer in this industry at the time. Lee became one of the defining faces of what's often called the golden age of porn, a period she herself later summed up simply. They were making real movies that happened to have sex in them. She'd go on to win the AVN Award for Best Actress in 1991 for The Masseuse, and she was inducted into both the XRCO and AVN Halls of Fame in the early 90s. Off-screen, her husband and frequent collaborator was Bud Lee, who also appears in Body Girls. The 2 were married for roughly a decade before divorcing, and Bud Lee later married fellow performer Asia Carrera. After stepping away from adult film in the mid-1990s, Hyapatia Lee moved into music, releasing albums with her band Double Euphoric. and later became an advocate and cultural teacher within a Cherokee community organization in Indiana, drawing on her own Cherokee and Irish heritage. None of this happens in a vacuum. 1982 was the year Jane Fonda released her workout video, built off her best-selling workout book, and it's widely credited with kicking off the at-home fitness boom that defined the decade. Striped leotards, violet tights, leg warmers, all suddenly everywhere. Gyms, which had largely been male spaces before this, saw an influx of women following Fonda's lead, and the leotard and leg warmer look moved from workout studios straight into everyday fashion. Adult film, as it often did, followed the trend almost immediately. Bodygirls arrived squarely inside that wave in 1983, and Chinn didn't stop there. A year later, he and Hyapatia Lee made a second fitness-themed feature together, Let's Get Physical, its title a nod to the Olivia Newton-John hit that had become the era's unofficial workout anthem. Where Bodygirls used a gym and a bodybuilding contest as its backdrop, Let's Get Physical shifted the setting to a dance school, giving Lee a chance to draw on her own background as a trained dancer. Of the two, most later reviewers rate Let's Get Physical as the stronger film, better plotted, more confidently performed. But the pairing says something about how quickly this corner of the industry could turn a mainstream cultural moment into its own material. In conclusion, Bodygirls was never going to be remembered as a landmark. It didn't reshape obscenity law, it didn't launch a scandal, and nobody involved in making it seem to think they were doing anything more than telling a quick, disposable story dressed up in leotards. But small films like this one are exactly the kind of artifact that ends up telling a bigger story than it meant to. A snapshot of a single year when an entire country, gyms and grocery stores and adult film sets alike, was chasing the same trend at the same time. It also stands as a quiet marker in Hyapatia Lee's career. One of the earliest credits for a performer who would go on to write, direct, and shape her own work across a decade in an industry that rarely gave its stars that kind of control. And 40 years later, it hasn't entirely disappeared. In 2023, Vinegar Syndrome restored Bodygirls and paired it with Let's Get Physical for a Blu-ray release under its Picorama line, giving the film a small second life as a curiosity from the last years before home video reshaped the industry that made it. It's not a film anyone would call great, but it's a film that couldn't have been made in any other year. And that, more than anything else, is why it's still worth talking about.